Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to Learn Live. We are super excited to be having you here today for the last episode in our series on Azure SQL Fundamentals. Today, we'll be covering putting it all together with Azure SQL. And today, once again, for the sixth time, I am joined by Bob Ward. Bob, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us again today.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everybody else who's joining. This should be a fun one, kind of different than the other ones we've been doing. But yeah, can you believe it's been 6 weeks of learning Azure SQL together? So this ought to be a very fun one today.
Yeah, I agree. And for people just tuning in, maybe for the first time, can you give folks a bit of a summary of kind of where we've been and where we're going?
It's good you asked that because you're going to talk about this, I believe, throughout today and at the end. You may have missed some of our previous episodes. You probably want to go back and watch those and learn. And we all started this journey 6 weeks ago describing what is Azure SQL. It's a branding, right, of a suite of cloud services for SQL and Azure, including Azure SQL Server, SQL Server and Azure Virtual Machine, Azure SQL Managed Instance, and then Azure SQL Database. And we talked about the various flavors of why would you pick one of those as kind of like a what to choose when type session and get you really familiar with the Azure ecosystem and all these type of capabilities of each of these Azure services. And then we went in like, hey, you got to set this thing up somehow. You got to install it first to use it. So deploying configuration. And remember, Anna, the whole idea was to kind of compare and contrast SQL Server experience to Azure SQL's experience. And so we had to cover the meat and potatoes, not in any particular order, but we started with security. Then we talked about performance. And then last week was a great session on availability. And then you got to wrap it all up somehow. How do you wrap up Azure SQL after 6 weeks? And so today is that, putting it all together. And Anna, especially, you might comment a little bit here, really interesting because it was your idea. It's like, how do we go bigger in the cloud? It's got to be something more than just migrating, right?
Yeah, definitely. And this is an exciting one. And this is one that's different from the other ones in the sense that we're really going to look to you all to engage with us. So, if you want to follow along or if you want to go access the module later, this is where you can access that module at the end of the session. But like I said, this session is the most engaging, the most interactive sessions of all our sessions. We have, Bob, you're not going to believe this. Hopefully you're going to like this, but we have 12 knowledge checks. So we have lots of questions which are going to spike discussion and help us understand what you've learned and help you understand what you've learned and feel validated that you really can put it all together. So this is going to be a really fun one. And then at the end, because we think we're going to have a little extra time, we have some awesome, cool demos. Bob, do you want to give a little sneak peek maybe so people stick around as to what we're doing at the end of this?
Well, first of all, once again, you've proven yourself to be the professor that everybody doesn't want to get when they go to college. 12 knowledge measures. Super great. I'm sure there won't be any ways you're going to trip anybody up in these knowledge measures, of course. So everybody stay tuned for that because it's always fun to see how Anna tries to trick everyone in the knowledge measures. But seriously, those are great things because you need to kind of verify. And for us, it's really important to see, are you learning what we're teaching you? But yeah, and it's going to be pretty cool. There's some stuff, we've been doing this for a while and there's some new things that are coming in Azure almost every month. So I've got something to show you about online migrations. That ought to be kind of fun. But I'm not the only one that has something new to show, I believe.
Yeah,
Right?
it's true. I've got something that myself and a colleague have been working on that we can share parts of it today. So that'll be exciting as well. And then after all that, if you're still want to stick around with us, we will do kind of an AMA at the end. So we'll answer any questions you might have about SQL or Azure SQL. And I do want to encourage you all to head over to Learn TV. So that's aka.ms/LearnTV. And the reason for that is all these questions we're going to be doing, we have a very nice polling capability in Learn TV. If you're coming in from somewhere else like YouTube or Twitch, totally fine. Just put your answers in the chat. But if you come in through Learn TV, it makes it a little bit better of an experience. Okay, so all that being said, let's get started. So we're going to be talking about putting it all together. And really, when we thought about this, a while back when we were putting this all together, we said, it might be nice to have some scenarios based on real world customer stories or customer situations where we ask people who've been watching, how would you handle this scenario, and what are some decisions you might make? And, in an in-person world, we'd have out whiteboards and we'd be walking around the room. And since it's not quite the world we live in, we're going to do it all virtually. So we have, like I mentioned, lots of questions to kind of evaluate what you think of these scenarios and their potential architectures. And on top of that, what we're going to challenge you to do is each scenario will have a hashtag associated with it. So a hashtag that you can use on Twitter or LinkedIn. So if you actually want to go forward and even go further and actually building some architecture diagrams or solutions, you can always tweet at us or use the hashtag on Twitter or LinkedIn, and we'll kind of share some of those good solutions with the rest of the community. So all that being said, we'll give you a ton of additional information. We'll give you lots of resources. We'll talk about some things that didn't quite fit into other modules, but we think is important for you to know. And then we'll give you a call to action, probably a few call to actions. But so busy day today. And so let's get right into this first scenario. So this scenario is about a global content delivery network, or a global CDN system. And the scenario is as follows. And Bob, try to pay attention, because we're going to quiz you on, what you think stands out here. Yeah, you didn't know that.
Another quiz for Bob. I love it.
Yeah, this is a separate quiz specifically for you.
Okay.
Okay. So this scenario says your customer is a provider for services and content delivery across the globe. They've requested your assistance in architecting a system that can handle thousands of writes per second to what is essentially an operational data mart. They also need to be able to perform real-time analytics on the data to determine trends, identify anomalies, and these things they're currently doing with SQL CLR. Now, they're not looking for a data warehouse, and they utilize large portions of the SQL surface area, but they need to be able to scale where their users live. So that's kind of like the big piece of this scenario. But then from a security perspective, they are trying to determine which authentication methods they should use in their hybrid environment. While the main solution and application is going to live in Azure, there's also 4 things you really need to think about. 1, an application on a non-Azure machine that is domain joined, a legacy application where they can't change the driver or the connection string on a non-Azure machine, multiple users that run reports from SQL admin tools on non-Azure machines that are not domain joined. So there's a few scenarios in there, and wherever possible, they obviously want to eliminate hard coding of passwords or secrets in the connection strings or the applications, and in tools where possible to enhance their authentication. So a lot of things going on. Bob, if you had to take a look at this, what are some things that kind of immediately stand out to you?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I mean, I do like the way you broke this out, because quite frankly, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you kind of pulled some of these from actual situations where us or our field or somebody at Microsoft has worked with a customer. So I love the way you kind of organize this. The way I look at it in 2 paragraphs here. One is about capabilities I need that feels a little bit about like some scaling performance scenario, capabilities I need, maybe some regional requirements you have here. You have some requirements around, and features that are required to use that may exist in one. I'm trying to think in my head in the first paragraph about the what to use when.
Right.
SQL and Azure VM, managed instance, Azure database. And I'm sure, knowing you would probably prefer us to be able to do a platform as a service scenario here. So for example, one thing that sticks out to me already is that word globe, across the globe, like kind of it's a regional type thing. I always look for things like numbers, so thousands of writes per second kind of stand out to me. It's interesting you said that you don't need a warehouse, but you need some analytics using CLR. So I'm already thinking in terms, and I see the word SQL surface area. So I'm thinking in terms of, the SQL capabilities that I need that may exist in one choice versus the other, one Azure SQL offering, but I don't need a warehouse. So I'm probably going to be able to stick with, one of the ones that we have for Azure SQL. So that's that first paragraph sticks out. And the second one, it's interesting because, you might be given this, you may be, for example, you're a consultant or you are an architect and somebody hands this to you. Probably the best thing to do in the second one is to break it like in bullet points and highlight, here are different ways I've got to authenticate. That was the key. I need to be able to authenticate. And these are real world scenarios. So I would take a bullet point for each one of these and, figure out, which goes with which, almost a table you could build, right? Of which solution I have, and then what authentication is best suited for that. Of course, when you say I want to eliminate using passwords or eliminate hard coding, that's a requirement that I got to consider, when I'm making all those choices. So I have, in the first paragraph, I have some capabilities that are really going to lead me towards which of that Azure SQL offering is best for this. And then the second paragraph, it's all about connecting together what is the right authentication method for a given user, app, or tool that I need.
Definitely. And I forgot to mention this, but I did put together some hints that I kind of bolded some things, but you hit most of them. So great job.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah. Maybe, I had some of them that weren't bolded, but some of these are, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly. These are just some things that stood out to me as well.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is we're going to do a lot of things at once. And let me see. So here it is. So here, what you're seeing on the screen is the scenario. Again, same scenario, exactly the same. You can see the hashtag. So if you want to submit anything via the hashtag, you can do that as well. We're going to do the first 3 questions, and then we'll go through them. And then we have 3 more questions that are really focused more on the security side of the thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to put up all these questions for you in the polls, but we can only pin 1 poll at a time. So we're basically going to give you some time to take a stab at identifying the answers to each of these questions, and then we'll go through them one by one. How does that sound, Bob?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Cool. Awesome. So let's just talk a little bit about what these questions are, and then if we have any questions coming in from any of our streaming platforms, we'll talk about some of those too. So like Bob mentioned, this first question is really going to be kind of your what to use when. So which deployment option of Azure SQL is going to be best for this scenario? The second question, it really gets into some of the things we talked about in Module 5 around availability. So how will they scale over multiple regions with multiple queries happening at the same time while isolating read workloads from write workloads? So really, you need to think about your what to use when from the first module, as well as availability in the 5th module. And then the third one, this is one that kind of goes back to the security module, Module 3. So here I'm giving you guys some hints if you want to go look at Azure SQL Fundamentals to try to figure some of these out. But the third one is, which authentication method would you recommend for the application on an Azure virtual machine? So go ahead and take a stab at trying to understand what the answers to each of these questions are. I'm going to do a quick peek to see if we have any questions that have come in throughout. Let's see. Oh, it looks like we do actually have these 3 polls posted and people have started to answer. So great job. Keep answering those questions. Bob, when, just as a refresher for some people, and this is going to come up in our next set of questions, can you kind of talk to us about some of these different authentication methods? Maybe give a little tips or hints for those folks that might be not remembering, or this wasn't something we went super far deep into.
Well, I think part of the key is that Azure AD authentication is an option for you in many situations, right? The problem is that, like, if you think about that last option here about like a legacy type app that doesn't want to change stuff, that becomes more difficult because you have to change something to be able to connect to that. But a lot of these options, I think that the key thing for people to think of about is that you don't have to be in Azure to use Azure AD, right? That's all possible to use that. And so I like the idea, in my mind personally, as I'm looking at this, I keep seeing the word like live in Azure. To me, that's an, in Azure environment. And then I've got a non-Azure machine, a non-Azure machine, a non-Azure machine. So even in these non-Azure machine areas, I think Azure AD is a possibility. I just got to figure out what is the right way to authenticate, depending, like in some cases you said domain joined or not domain joined. And so that could dictate what option I have. But the key is Azure AD is an option in some of those scenarios. It's just, how do you combine that with our different, integration points with Azure AD? So I think one of these is probably going to need a SQL auth, scenario based on, eliminating hard coding or something of that nature. I think Azure AD can be an option for a lot of these. Just what combination do you pick, right?
Right. Awesome. Looks like we actually have a decent number of answers in for some of these questions.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we can at least take a stab at that first question.
Okay.
So I'm actually gonna leave this up so people can keep looking at the question, but then we'll go to it. We're focusing on the first question right now. So which is the best Azure SQL deployment option. So if you haven't answered that one, go ahead and answer it. If you're streaming in from Twitch or Twitter or YouTube, go ahead and add a comment of what you think the answer to the first question is. Now, Bob, can you kind of take us through the process for thinking about this question?
Sure. So make sure I've got this right here. So in the first one, I don't think it lists D, does it? Is that right? With the one that got pinned?
Oh, yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure. So it just shows A, B, and even though you show A, B, and C and D, there's only A, B, and C choices for them, right?
Right.
Okay. So process elimination. We have to eliminate Azure SQL single database out of this because we need a large portion of the SQL surface area, including CLR. So already I know I need a managed instance here. I could use VM, but I would not say that is the best option for me because it's not platform as a service. It would work, but there'd be a lot of more effort, especially when it comes to this global thing you're talking about. You're talking about, like, I even missed the scale where users live. I didn't highlight that, but doing that would require a lot more work on your part for something like Azure VM. So to me, a managed instance is probably the best. Again, that was your question here. Which offers the best fit? It wasn't just what is a fit, it was the best fit. So it can't be database. To me, it would be B.
Yeah, and let me just go ahead to that one, and that is the correct answer.
Okay.
I think you hit it right on the head there. Really, the customer needs CLR, so Azure SQL Database isn't an option. For those of you coming in through Learn TV, Elastic Pools literally was not an option, but Elastic Pools is just a deployment option within Azure SQL Database. So if single database doesn't support CLR, neither is Elastic Pools.
Right.
And then, deciding between VM and MI, both are going to work. But when we talk about best fit, I think moving towards more of a platform as a service is going to be much handier, especially when we get into the next question, when we talk about scaling over multiple regions. So this next question we're going to answer. So we'll go ahead and pin question 2 to the top of your polls so you can see it handy. Please go ahead and answer that one if you haven't already. Or if you're streaming from somewhere else, just go ahead and put in the chat. I have been seeing a few answers from other places like YouTube. So thanks for your responses. But this question is, how will they scale over multiple regions with multiple queries happening at the same time while isolating read workloads from write workloads? This one's a little bit tricky. Bob, do you have any tips for people who haven't quite answered yet?
Well, you did use the word scale, regions, multiple queries, isolating read workloads, use several different things. You got to go back and think in terms of what we talked about. Scale wasn't just about region. It was about like thousands of writes per second. Remember that kind of type conversation? If you remember back to our discussion about what to choose when with different tiers, Business Critical gives you the best IO performance out of any of our options. So already in my head, I'm thinking in terms of eliminating A and B because I think I want that Business Critical capability, especially from IO performance. I suppose it's possible when you really dig into the requirements at a detailed level with a customer that general purpose might serve their needs, but my guess is Business Critical is what you need. So I'm down now to C and D personally because I've eliminated A and B. And then I think in terms of scaling where they live, ensuring that I isolate read workloads, even though geo-replication might be an option, I think auto failover groups is probably the better option because remember, it's auto. That's one of the key aspects to it. I do get that read replica, if I remember correctly, not only with Business Critical, it's another reason why Business Critical could be your best choice, right? I get that Business Critical read replica in my primary region. I also get it in the other region with auto failover groups. So a combination of scaling with the writes per second, a combination of getting those read replicas that I get in both scenarios, I probably would pick C.
Yeah, you are definitely right. And there was a little bit of a trick in here. Of course, I had to bring that in. But remember in the first question, we decided to go with Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, for Azure SQL Managed Instance, we don't support geo-replication today. So once you pick Business Critical based on, I think if I go back, the scenario actually says they need thousands of write per second, real-time analytics. So I think, just like you, I think business critical is going to be a better solution for this. And then to get across to another region, auto failover groups is really the only simple option that they have there.
But there you go again, with your twist or your trick. Did you say it was tricky? Yeah, I think you said It was tricky. But you're 100% right. We did talk about that in the last module, that for managed instance auto failover groups, your only option.
Right. So okay. Good reminder.
Good reminder.
Not a trick, just a good reminder.
It's a trick. It's always a trick.
All right, and then the third question, so this would round out the first part of our scenario 1, is which authentication method would you recommend for the application on an Azure VM? So for this one, like Bob mentioned earlier, you will have a few different options available, but you need to think about which is going to be the most viable for this solution. So go ahead and get your answers in for that one. Let's see. And I guess maybe a hint from me is that it is running on an Azure virtual machine. So that might simplify doing something that doesn't require passwords. Okay, so it looks like we have a good number of responses in. I've also seen a few, maybe a B and a D across other streaming platforms. So I think, Bob, you can go ahead and take it away.
Well, if this is a good one, because we did talk a little bit about this in some of our modules. I don't know how deep we really went into this topic, actually, to be honest with you. So I'm so glad we're covering this. And here's the great thing about is that if you don't get this right, we document this pretty well about what would you pick in certain scenarios. But if you think about the fact that Anna had these different application and machines, this is the one that wasn't Azure, right? And you did say recommended way. So there could be multiple ways. But first of all, SQL Auth, even though it could work, I'm trying to get away from passwords, as you just said. Remember, that was one of your requirements, as much as possible. So just eliminate E out of the gate. Now I got these other options. And so what you're going to want to do at this point, in my personal opinion, is pick the simplest way to do this. And if you look at what's available in Azure, multi-factor authentication does work. But again, it's multi-factor authentication. So now somebody has that extra step of verifying this with something else. Integrated authentication is going to require a domain, right, to be able to do this. And you may or may not have that set up in Azure. Maybe you have a non-Azure machine of domain, which is one of your examples. But in Azure VM, it could be very, very possible this is not a domain join Azure VM. So then it comes down. So let's just take away A for a second. So now I'm down to like B and D. As it turns out, this managed identity is a really cool concept in Azure that gives you the simplest way of getting going for a resource that's already in Azure with Azure AD. So for me, I'm probably going to pick D.
Yeah, definitely. And there were some good hints in there, Bob, for the rest of the question. So hopefully people were listening and paying attention. And if we look at the responses we got in, most of you said Azure AD authentication managed identity, although some of you also mentioned integrated authentication. And like Bob mentioned, in general, managed identities is going to be the recommendation for applications specifically that are running in Azure VM. So that's kind of where I rationalize it, which I think is very similar to what you said as well, Bob.
I agree.
Awesome. Okay, so now you got a taste of the what to use when, because you talked about an application on an Azure VM using managed identities. Now we're going to dive into 3 more questions specifically around how to authenticate. And again, like Bob mentioned, this is something we didn't spend a ton of time on in the live session, and so we think it's a good exercise to kind of go through, dive a little bit deeper, apply some of the things you did learn to this scenario. So the next 3 questions, take it just like before, take a few moments, try to come up with an answer to each of these questions. We're going to go ahead and put them all up, but we'll give you a few minutes to kind of answer them. And these questions are all about trying to figure out what the authentication method is. So for example, question 4 is going to be for an application on a non-Azure machine that is domain joined, so non-Azure but is domain joined. And the next is for SQL admin tool, so a user that's using SSMS or PowerShell on a non-Azure machine that is not domain joined. So a little different from the first scenario, because now you have a user using SSMS, SQL tools, and but they're not domain joined. and not on Azure. And then the sixth one, and I think actually this one is either going to be really easy or it's going to trick a lot of you. This one is, which authentication method would you recommend for the application on the legacy application where you can't change the driver or connection string on the non-Azure machine? So these are some good questions. Take a few minutes to think about them. A few people have had some comments saying, thanks, Bob, for your explanation. So nice explanation, Bob, as well as great. We have an interesting question on Twitch that is not related to Azure SQL. And nothing on Learn. It's actually an interesting little question, but not related to what we're talking about. So I'm going to skip that one.
Okay. But if it's about Baylor Bears basketball, I can answer those. I'm here today to answer those.
So certain sports questions are allowed in this in this Azure SQL discussion. We will allow sports conversations.
We will allow that.
Other topics only at the discretion of us.
Right.
Okay. Let me take a look and see if we've gotten some responses in. And you guys, we have some time while we're answering these questions. So if people have other questions that they want us to answer during this time, feel free to just post it from wherever you're streaming from. We are looking at that to see that what you guys are thinking and what you guys are asking about.
And I just want to comment that I'm glad you're doing this because this is real world. I mean, your customers out there are going to have every way you can think of in today's world where they haven't moved if you have everything to the cloud, which you won't, you said hybrid environment, this is a reality what's going to happen. You're going to be in a discussion with your customer. They're going to say, well, hey, what about this? I've got this app over here in this domain joined environment that's not in Azure. What are you going to do about that, right? And for you to have preparation of what is the recommended way, what are the different options, what is possible, and you don't have to memorize these, but to have in your mind what is there and what's recommended, I think is a very, very, very valid approach, and it's real world.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I definitely think, and thank you. I'm glad you think these are useful and you're not upset about having to answer these questions.
I mean, I didn't say they weren't tricky. I just think they're useful.
Okay, just for time's sake, I'm going to dive into this first question. So I'm just going to put it up. We're going to pin it on Microsoft Learn. Again, even if you're streaming from not Microsoft Learn, go ahead and put in the chat on Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, Periscope, wherever, what you think the answer to this question is. So specifically, this is an application on a non-Azure machine that is domain joined. And one sidebar here, we actually, we've used this internally as well. And we had an architect come back to us with this super awesome table that was like, if it's domain joined, if it's, I should have actually pulled that in here. But these
That's
are
what
things
I would recommend doing after this is all over. If you go for the client, I would have a table of this to say, okay, this one makes sense. And remember, it's not just important to say what's possible, what's recommended is the best and why. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. So let's go ahead. Let's take a look at this first question. We've gotten a decent number of responses. And it looks like on YouTube, we got a C and a D, and it looks like on Learn, we're getting mostly A's, but a few B's and a few D's. So we're kind of all over the place. So maybe we need some help.
Okay.
Why don't you take us through it?
Yeah, I mean, again, like we just talked about, remember the overall requirement you said, you would like to eliminate hard-coded passwords and so forth, right? So SQL Auth, I'm going to take that off the board here because it's even though it would work, this is the recommended way. So let's just take that. I'm eliminating that one, right? Plus, it's a non-Azure machine, and we just said managed identity is an Azure thing. You need to be in Azure. So let's take away D for a second now. Now I'm left with these last three. So multi-factor authentication could be a possibility, I suppose, here. But again, that requires a little more complexity. So even though it's a possibility, it probably wouldn't be recommended. That leaves me with the last two options. And so client ID certificate, I think that would work here, actually, Anna. But I want the best option. And so since I'm domain joined, integrated authentication is a great way to do this. So that's what I would pick. I think A would probably be your best, again, the recommended way.
Definitely. Yeah, I would say A is the recommended and probably the easiest way, considering that you are domain joined. But you are correct in that the client ID and certificate is a way forward. You just have to create an application identity for your application in Azure Active Directory, and then go through that process of getting the certificate and the private token, all that good stuff. But yeah, integrated authentication is going to be the recommended approach there. And I think if I go back to the responses we got, all in all, that was the most answered response. But I think a few people, I think, honestly, Bob, I think the way you do that process of elimination is like, oh, well, they can't use this because of this. They could use this. Let's hold that. And then let's see what else they can use, and all the options they can use. What's going to be the best one? I think that's a great
That's the best way to take an exam, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. You could go take the SAT and ace it, I
bet. Oh, gosh.
Okay. The last question for this scenario. Oh, wait, no, it's not.
I think you have 2 more, right?
2 more. Yeah. So, the second to last question, this is, same scenario. We're trying to minimize password usage, but this time we're trying to recommend authentication methods for accessing from SQL admin tools. So like SSMS, Azure PowerShell, Azure Data Studio, SQL CMD, all those SQL tools you know and love. How do we give folks access on non-Azure machines that are not domain joined? So think about those requirements and how they might play into what you're selecting.
Right.
So go ahead.
Are you starting to get some answers there?
Yeah, it looks like we've got a few answers coming in. Would love to see a few more answers from YouTube or Twitch or even Learn. So keep your answers in. But it looks like option C is winning. A few people have said E, which is SQL Auth, and a few people, maybe 1 or 2 people each, are saying Azure AD Auth using integrated or client ID or certificate. Okay. I think we can go ahead and probably take a stab at this one. We've kind of talked a lot about how to do these eliminations.
Well, let's eliminate D. Again, we did that last time. It's non-Azure machines, so we can't do that. Well, let's just get rid of that. It's a non-domain join, so I can't do A either. Remember what we just said? You have to be domain join machine to do A. So I'll get rid of A and D. I'm left with B, C, and E. Now it gets a little more interesting. If I'm not mistaken, with like say Management Studio or these tools, I can't do the client ID cert method. I have to be like an app that I can write to do that. I can't just use the tool. So I'm going to eliminate that one. Now I'm left with MFA and SQL Auth. So even though SQL Auth works here, remember we did say we'd like to eliminate the need to do that. So if I have an option to do that, I would prefer that. Would be my recommended ways. It turns out, like I'll just pick on SSMS, there is a way with SSMS to go in and choose in that when you connect. I think I know I've seen you do this before. Where you go in SSMS, you connect. You might have even shown that actually in one of the demos you did during our modules. You can pick MFA. Then you do that because you're Azure AD enabled. And then you would actually go through the MFA process, phone, whatever you have set up to do that. So for me, it's about the recommended way. So again, I'm keeping around C and E, but I think C would be recommended way.
Yep, I think that does it. And yeah, depending on your tool, this is supported. But like you said, SSMS supports this, ADS supports this. Right. Most of the SQL tools are going to support using MFA. With Azure AD. So great job to those of you that got that one. I'm just going to do a quick scan. It looks like a lot of people did get it. A lot of people got a little tripped up. I think, this is a new topic, a newer topic. And again, something we kind of didn't spend a ton of time on. So it just makes me feel a little bit more glad that we are talking about it. And hopefully, as we've even just gone from questions 4 or 3 where they started talking about this topic, you can kind of see how Bob is using his other knowledge, like, oh, we have to eliminate managed identity because that's only for Azure VM. So you can kind of learn with us if this is a new topic for you. Awesome. So
one more, huh?
One more. So this is the last one in this scenario. There's another scenario, Bob. So don't think it's over. It's not over.
Wait, we're not done?
No, we're not done after this. But remembering that the goal was to eliminate passwords as much as possible.
Yes.
This question says, what do you recommend for an application on a legacy machine where you can't change the driver or connection strings? And obviously this is on a non-Azure machine.
Right.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, it looks like a lot of the answers, a lot of people, there's a few saying A, B, C, D, but a lot of people are saying E, which I find pretty interesting.
Well, I want to eliminate the need for that, but I'm going to use the process elimination again, and if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, so non-Azure machine, so get rid of D, right? Now it doesn't say non-domain, but it says a legacy application. I'm assuming this is non-domained. Is that true, Anna? Non-domain machine,
Yes.
probably? Okay. So I got to get rid of A. So I can't do that one either. So now I'm left with what? B, C, and E. So here's the problem. I can't change the connection string. To do Azure AD Auth, which again, it's a legacy app. You didn't have that before, Azure AD Auth. You got to change the connection string to Azure AD Auth, unfortunately. So this is going to eliminate actually A, B, C, and D, unfortunately, right? We've already eliminated A, and we eliminated D, but I now have eliminated B and C as well. So even though you want to try to eliminate the password scenario, easier only option here, not just the recommended option, it is the only option.
Yeah, and we've had some people, I'm just going to put up this slide that kind of walks through all the different options you could pick. And this is even identifying, whether or not you are domain joined or not. But we have had this question before about the legacy application where you can't change the connection string. If you can't change the connection string, Bob, and this is routed to like some local SQL server, how are you even going to connect to Azure SQL database?
Well, with SQL, you have the ability to do like an alias. So you could be using an alias that you set up to redirect the app on the client machines to the new Azure SQL server. So you still wouldn't have to change the server name or something of that nature. You could take that local server name, again, tie that to Azure, and then you'd be covered. So,
gotcha.
But are you telling me that we just went through all of that?
Yeah.
And you had a visual slide that shows all of this? Is that true?
Yes, I held this back so we could go through the questions.
I know, I love it because we just went through a very this paragraph description, all these different multiple choice questions, decisions, and some people are very visual. I'm a very visual person. I love this because it shows me a very real world scenario where my SQL deployment's in the cloud, but I could have all these different situations where apps and machines are both in Azure, not in Azure, and what is possible, but also what is recommended. So I like it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, this is something we actually put together with the security team, something that they call the Azure SQL Security Best Practices Playbook. So that's a section in the Azure SQL documentation where they have a bunch of common security scenarios around Azure SQL database where you can go and kind of see what they've done in these scenarios that come up pretty often, like this one. How do I connect and how do I eliminate passwords? So fun fact there, inside look. Okay, so we have another scenario. Bob, do you think you're ready for more?
I don't know. I got to just look. I got to think about this with my head, right? So I don't get stumped here. But yes, go ahead. It's okay.
So, so this is the second scenario. There's only two scenarios. So if you're like, I'm out, I can't do this anymore. There's just one more scenario. This is it. And this one is for a mission critical application. So, let me just tell you about the scenario and then we'll have Bob go through some of the highlights that he sees from this. So let's assume you're hired to architect a mission critical cloud application that requires 99.995% availability because downtime might be life threatening. So you could think of this example, think of it like a 911 dispatch. So it really needs to be high performance and highly available because any delay in response can carry a high risk. Now, given the sensitivity of this, if we consider 911 dispatch, this personal or collected information or medical information, data sovereignty must be guaranteed. Now, your main mission is to ensure that the app is designed and deployed with appropriate data redundancy and fault resilience to meet the availability and data sovereignty goals. So you're going to be thinking a lot about the availability module from last week here. Now, additionally, mission critical cloud applications, especially like 911 dispatch we talked about, also stolen credit card, corporate security, they're concerned about protecting sensitive data, but they also need DBAs to be able to perform their jobs. This is a very common scenario, SQL Server and Azure SQL, but in this scenario, DBAs must not be able to see sensitive data stored in specific columns, And all access to tables containing sensitive data must be monitored. So you might need to classify the sensitive data. And at the same time, DBAs need to be able to troubleshoot performance using the Azure portal. So some of the things in the performance module that Bob showed you, you can do through the Azure portal, as well as SSMS and Azure Data Studio. And they also need to be able to create new contained database users who must be mapped to Azure AD principles. So there's a lot in here. I'm going to highlight a few things, but Bob, I'd love to get your take on what really stands out to you about this scenario.
Well, just like before, you broke it down into overall capabilities that the application needs, which is going to help dictate your choice, the what to use when choice, and even like a service tier choice potentially, right? Here, there's some performance discussions. I went right to the number, by the way. I'm a number guy, so I went right to that 4.5 nines thing. I'm like, okay, that eliminates a lot of stuff from a choice perspective that we have right now with Azure. Because again, you want probably not just that to work, you want us to back it up with our service level agreement, I'm guessing, because that's what's required. So if you're going to come to platforms of service, you want Microsoft to back that up. So there's a choice you're going to need to make there. The sovereignty thing, I did kind of did resonate with me, probably not as much as you highlighted right here. I did see, though, that you need to ensure the app is designed and deployed with appropriate redundancy and fault tolerance to meet both of these goals. So I'm thinking in terms of availability here and some sort of regional, capability I need to put into this whole thing. So that's kind of what stood out to me in the first one. And the second one's interesting. This wasn't about authentication as much as it was about information protection. But you also put at the very end there some comments about, I need the DBA to be able to do something both out and inside of Azure. So there's probably going to be some authorization that you've got to give them, which isn't necessarily how they're going to authenticate, but how are you going to give them access to Azure? Remember we talked about this before in security. How are you going to get access to things outside of Azure and then Azure SQL? And then what are you going to do inside of Azure SQL? So I see both an information protection comment there and kind of a authentication, or excuse me, an authorization that you've got to do on the second part.
Yeah, definitely. You definitely called out the highlights and things that we're going to be asking questions about. So hopefully that was useful to some users. Just like before, we're going to do the first 3 questions and we'll talk about them. We'll give you some time to answer these first 3 questions. We'll go through them, then we'll do the second 3 questions. And the first 3 questions are really focused on the what to use when, as well as the availability of this application and database. Now, while we are giving you time to answer these, actually, let me go through them real quick. The first question is quite simply, which Azure SQL deployment option makes the most sense here? And then the second question is asking about geo-redundancy and high availability. How are they going to achieve that? And the third question is talking about co-location. So this one you have to think a little bit carefully about. Now, we got a question in Learn TV, which I want to talk about because I know someone will answer, probably one of our wonderful moderators who are helping us answer this, our SMEs from our team. But I wanted to just kind of talk about this one because I think it's interesting. The question is, why, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because I'm not sure I understand it, but I think what the person is asking is, why does accessing Azure SQL database through SSMS using Azure Active Directory password or integrated never work? So this is a question that came in, I think is really interesting. Bob, do you have any thoughts on this? I also have some thoughts.
So, so the question is like, why won't integrated work with AD? Is that kind of why where would that not work?
Yes, I think the question specifically is like, I'm trying to access Azure SQL database. I'm using integrated. I'm trying to use password and it's not working.
Okay, so integrated, the key about integrated, you have to be domain joined, right? So that's a requirement. If you're not domain joined, then that would never work. Then I suppose that if you are domain joined, there is an issue with your account in Azure AD that's been authorized to get access through, it's an Azure AD problem at that point based on your account. I don't know how you feel about it, but that's kind of how I'd look at it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like for me personally, like I have a demo virtual machine where I log into Azure SQL database, sometimes as the Azure AD admin on an Azure SQL database, and I can't log in with password. And that's because my organization has restricted me from using password only, right? So for that, I have to use MFA, and that's why MFA is the only option really, because this is an Azure virtual machine, but it's not domain joined, so I can't use integrated. So I thought that was an interesting question. So thanks
Okay,
for.
so you were actually, in your case, it was more of a company policy, like in Microsoft,
Right.
where you could technically put in your Azure AD and password, right? But we restrict that capability because that's not as secure as MFA. In other words,
Right.
we're kind of forcing you. So you're not domain joined, so you could use integrated connection if you were domain joined, but we're going to force you to MFA because it's more secure, right?
Right. Yeah. And so that's an interesting place where your overall AD organization policies will have an effect here. So interesting.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so let's see. Let's see what the questions are. Oh, we did have a comment from one of our regulars. I see John Askew said lots of questions.
Yeah. Lots of knowledge
questions
measures
today.
today. Yes.
Yes, we want to really test your knowledge. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at this first question, which is which Azure SQL deployment option potentially offers the best fit for the solution? Bob, can you take us through that?
Sure. It's going to come right down to that 4.5 nines right out of the gate, right? And while in A, you might be able to find a way to do that, Anna, you personally could do this. We don't have an SLA for that. So you can't do A, right? And B, you can't do that either. There is no SLA for that. And we really don't need an elastic pool here. You did not mention any kind of need for that kind of type thing. Plus, I don't even think that is also part of the SLA for getting that 4.5 nines. So I think I'm going to need C. We don't specifically call out how you would do that. We can talk more about that, but I think C is going to have to be your best answer here.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if nothing else, it has to do with that SLA, like you mentioned. You can only get that SLA in Azure SQL database today. But also, if you look back at the scenario, they didn't really mention anything about using instance scoped capabilities. So it's possible that they didn't really need those anyway. So this helps as well.
Absolutely.
Now the second question was, so we're using Azure SQL Database, and it says which option is the best for them to enable geo redundancy and maintain high availability. Now this question is kind of an interesting question, maybe subjective, especially given some new information or new releases we can talk about that happened recently. But if we talk about the best option or the easiest option, which option is it going to be?
I mean, for me, Anna, if you're thinking about this, and I just think about in my head about what we covered, it was actually the last module. Both of these, could work. But you did call out an auto failover groups, the auto piece, that's pretty critical here. The fact that you're connecting through a given server, right? And then literally, if a failover is needed, you would fail over to the other region automatically. I think you called out that for geo-replication, you have to make a manual change to make that work. And so that would not be probably your best option there. There are some things that we've just released that might could help you, even things like DNS alias and so forth that we've talked about. But I think for me that B would be the best option.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And if we just take a look at what other people thought for this question, most people did also think auto failover groups is going to be the best. And again, that's just because when you deploy an auto failover group, we go ahead and give you something to connect to. So you connect to a name that's specific to the failover group, not specific to one of the Azure SQL Database logical servers. So when this failover happens or is required to happen, we can auto fail you over and you don't require any connection string changes. So that can help in keeping you more available. But maybe with DNS aliasing, like you were saying, like you could set up a similar system for your geo replicas. But I still think there would be a little bit of downtime during.
You still got to manually fail over.
Right. You still have to go decide that you're going to fail over.
Right.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so now for the third question, the last one in our first segment, what role does co-location play in this scenario? Looks like we've got a few answers in already. Go ahead and put your answers in. For all the people on Twitch and YouTube and Periscope, would love to see your answers as well in the chat. It looks like on Learn TV, we're getting a good amount of responses. Most people are saying B, so that's something to think about. A few people have said A, and a few people have said C. So Bob, why don't you go ahead, take us through it?
Yeah, I'm thinking back the scenario now, right? So, you know, you talked about data sovereignty, I believe, in this scenario a little bit, and availability that's needed. And we already said we're going to use an auto failover group, which, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, applies a different region that I'm going to have. So deploy to one region only can't apply here. Leveraging the auto failover group is great because it does give us what we need from a database perspective. But what if you built an Azure App Service application in, say, US East, and your auto failover group is, say, US West? And if the failover occurs in US East, the app itself could be not available in US East. So it seems to me to be as highly available as I need for this mission critical app, I better deploy the app as well in that region and have it set up so that if I fail over, the app will work in the region where the primary now is. Is that kind of how you see it?
Yeah, exactly. And this goes back to what we talked about near the end of module 5 last week in availability, is that thinking about if your application is ready is almost just as important as thinking about the SLA and availability of your database. We actually have a little diagram that we have from, again, something else that was actually used in the real world. But basically, what the goal here was to achieve the 5 nines SLA. We wanted to create 2 fully redundant application, basically stamps, in 2 separate regions. So that's kind of what you're seeing here. So you're seeing we're using zone redundancy in the business critical service tier. So that's going to enable us to have isolation across if there's a failover within an availability zone. So we kind of have that going for us. And then it's also going to give us that high availability in each region with the business critical service tier. You saw in module 5 how business critical fails over faster than, say, a general purpose database. Then we're going to deploy the database application, so the web application, like we talked about, in both regions. That's an important part of it. And for that, we can use Traffic Manager to basically probe and then decide, which app to point you to. And similarly, we can use a failover group, which is a little bit easier than setting up the application side. But for SQL DB, we can use a failover group, which allows you to have a read-write listener, like we talked about and you saw in module 5. And then we can also use some database monitoring logic. So that's what you're seeing in 5, this monitoring logic to basically make sure, like use a synthetic query to make sure that the database is available. And if it isn't, then go ahead and trigger up that failover for the applications. Now, one thing to consider is you do need to use regions that support availability zones for this solution. So something to think about, in the US, you might choose to use something like West US and East US. And now to test this, which is something you should do on occasion, you could actually activate a forced failover as part of the monitoring workflow. And you would also be able to see this RPO of 5 seconds and RTO of 30 seconds in this situation. Traffic managers are going to take care of detecting that outage and rerouting the application. So this is just one example of, something real world that was used with customers and how you can kind of see how they set this up to get the highest availability. So that's kind of the first part of our questions. Now, the second part goes a little bit more into data protection, as well as, like Bob mentioned, the ability to do something. So now we have 3 more questions. This is the last 3 knowledge check questions. Then we're going to do some other really cool stuff that you're not going to want to miss. But these last 3 questions are really about access and data protection and that sort of thing. So if I just go over the questions kind of briefly, the first question is, how can you ensure DBAs cannot see sensitive data stored in specific columns? So think carefully about this one. The next one is, how can you track access to tables containing sensitive data? So we talked about this in the security module a few weeks ago about different ways you can actually achieve this combination of results. And then the final questions is, how are DBAs going to be able to do the stuff they need to be able to do in the Azure portal in SSMS and also create new Azure AD principles. So think carefully about that one. And it's a little tricky. I'll just say it up front, Bob.
Of course it's tricky. I mean, right?
Yes.
But they're good questions. They're really good questions that are very real world based and are important for you to understand applying the concepts we've been teaching, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And we do have some questions. So again, just like before, go ahead and think about the answers to these questions. If you're streaming from not Learn TV, you can go ahead and put in the answers in Learn TV. You can also look for those questions. They should be posted now. But we did get a question on YouTube that I just wanted to kind of call out because it is an interesting question. I'm not sure we have the best answer for it, but this user says, this is not applicable. I'm assuming they're talking about the previous scenario. This is not applicable for a country which only has one region available, for example, Southeast Asia. So in that situation, Bob, do you have any guidance or tips on how to think about this?
What do you mean? So what do you mean by one region available?
Right. So, I would have to double check the documentation for this, but for example, I think what they're saying is let's say Southeast Asia only has one region, Southeast Asia.
You mean, in other words, I can't do zone redundancy.
Right. Or if I wanted to use an auto failover group, I have to pick another region. So right. How do I do that?
Yeah, I mean, so, but that's the whole idea of auto failover group, right? In fact, geo-replication is allowed to be done inside your region, and people we've seen do that isn't just for redundancy; they get extra replicas from that, right? But auto failover group requires a different region, if I'm not mistaken, and so, but that's the whole idea. You're going to need to pick a different region so that you have that redundancy in a different region. Now, I don't know if zone redundancy is available in that specific region. I have to look it up in the documentation. So you don't get that specific capabilities, but you do get the ability to still do auto failover to a different region.
Correct. Yeah.
Is that how you're thinking about it, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think they still might potentially, like, if Southeast, and again, I'd have to look this up, but if Southeast Asia is the only region available, then where would their other region for auto failover groups go to maintain data redundancy or data residency?
You mean for sovereignty purposes?
Data sovereignty, yeah.
Yeah, so I did have one scenario come up that's really interesting to think about, where somebody could not use an auto failover group or even geo-replication because the data itself could not be in that other region for sovereignty reasons, right?
Right.
So, but in that particular case, it's more of a situation where the applications are controlling different sets of data. They don't need that replication of data to go across. What they need is a replication of schema to go across to keep that in sync. So you have to use something else. You have to use another technique from some application-based scenario to keep schemas in sync, but the data is separate anyways. It can't even be redundant. What's important there is just to make sure that you have other things set up so that your data is available, right? Whether it's, we have automatic backup set up and so forth and those kind of type things so that you have at least a HADR story. And remember, if you do something like business critical, we have separate replicas of your data, even in the same region. And remember that the data itself, even like in general purpose, is redundant in storage. So we have redundancies of data even within a region, even if you don't use availability zones, and even if you can't do a failover group.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really great call out. So thank you. And thank you for the user who asked that question. I hope that answer kind of helps you. Okay, let's talk about these questions. So this first question is, how can you ensure DBAs cannot see sensitive data stored in specific columns? And it looks like most people, from what I'm seeing across platforms, have said A, but we did get a decent number of people saying C. Can you take us through that one, Bob?
Yeah, remember the concept here is that I want to ensure that a specific person can't access or see data in a column. So audit is not the answer, because that doesn't control access. That just allows you to audit access, right? Data classification is an interesting story. It allows you to tag things in columns, but it doesn't prevent anything. So there's no feature in classification say, oh, I'm tagging this as a GDPR column, and I won't let somebody see it just through that feature, right? Now, dynamic data masking is interesting. That's going to leave me C and D left right now. So dynamic data masking is interesting because the whole idea is to mask looking at data from a SQL perspective. Even you've run a SQL query or an app or so forth, but typically DBAs are the ones controlling the masks and the permissions to the masks. So they typically can see that. The only way to do this is C, because remember about always encrypted. Always encrypted is specifically designed for this separation, where the business owners or the app owners are the one controlling encryption, not the DBA. So I would say C.
Awesome. Yep, that is true. And yeah, some people might get tripped up by dynamic data masking, but I think you covered why that won't work, right? Good job. Okay, so this next question is, how can you track access to tables containing sensitive data? And for this one, we have more people saying A than C, but pretty split between that one. And then we also, I was just looking on other streaming platforms, looks like we also have a few A's there as well. Bob, you want to take us through this one? I think it's a little bit easier than the other one.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not going to be B because B has nothing to do with tracking. This is just setting up, classifying your data or masking data. So let's eliminate that. It can't be D either, even though audit allows you to audit stuff. It is not a way to track specifically access to tables containing sensitive data. So I'm left with A and C. And dynamic data masking, even though you may consider that sensitive data, there's no classification system for masking. It's just you doing a mask. So that leaves A to be the answer. You classify your data, and then because you classify it using our classification techniques, you for free, auditing will tell you somebody touched one of those things you classified.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a really interesting exercise. If you haven't gone through all the exercises for Azure SQL Fundamentals, recommend doing so. But in the third security module, there's an interesting exercise where you actually use SQL audit, data classification, and dynamic data masking all together to kind of provide this solution around tracking access, masking, and auditing, and tracking the sensitive data access as well.
Right.
Now the final question, so drum roll, like the only question left in the series before we get on to some other topics is, how can you allow DBAs to be able to troubleshoot performance via the Azure portal and SSMS and create new contained database users with Azure AD principles? Now, this one is a tricky one. So most people said C. A few people actually said D. So Bob, why don't you take us through what you think?
Sure. So if I read this right, you need access to the portal to do something and to SSMS, and you need to be able to have access to go in and create actual users, right? You need all of those capabilities. So just by looking at this, Azure AD groups are interesting because I can use Azure AD groups to give me some other thing. RBAC is going to give me access. I can take RBAC, for example, and assign that to an Azure user to get access in the portal to do something. And then I can use a combination of those. But none of these gave any hint in here about giving access to the SQL auth required to do this, to log into SSMS, and especially that admin right to go in and create these users. So once again, Anna, here you are tricking the world. Unfortunately, the answer to me has got to be D.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because basically what you would need to do is create an Azure AD group, maybe called SQL DBA, for the DBAs on the respective instance. And then you could assign the group to the Azure RBAC role SQL Server contributor. That's going to help them see stuff in the Azure portal. And then finally, you need to set the whole Azure AD group to be the Azure AD admin. And that's the only way any of them are going to be able to do things like create new Azure AD principles. So kind of a lot going on in that situation. Have a little diagram here that talks about preventing DBA access to sensitive data. So we're seeing some of those things like we saw in the other questions, like we're tagging sensitive data with data classification. This is kind of a good review. We're also encrypting data with always encrypted. We're auditing to log analytics so we can see kind of what's going on using Kusto query language or KQL. And then you're seeing some of that scenario about the SQL DBA group that's then able to not only have the Azure RBAC role, but also the Active Directory admin to create new users. So a lot of scenarios, but hopefully this was useful to viewers to actually putting their knowledge that they've learned throughout Azure SQL Fundamentals to the test. What do you think, Bob?
No, I think it's important. I mean, there was a lot of knowledge checks. But think about what we're doing. We are trying to put the entire thing together for you. And some of it may have felt, to those of you paying attention here or watching us, a little detailed, hyper-focused, right? But it's important because we want you, and again, Anna, you said this at the very beginning, people have gone through all of our modules, including this one, and passed certification, like the DP300 certification exam. And some of this stuff that's in this module is actually needed to be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And, we're going to switch gears a little bit. We've talked about the scenarios. I also mentioned there were some things that I met with Bob about, and he was like, hey, we got to talk about this. It doesn't exactly fit in the meat and potatoes. So Bob, can you talk about, what else should people know when they look at Azure SQL?
This is the classic hyper-focusedness of our project together. Anna, the funny backstory, if you remember, was we had a OneNote that we used to design this course. And boy, by the end of this thing was huge with all sorts of notes and comments. And then towards the end of our discussion, I showed you a OneNote tab and I said, Anna, what about this stuff? And you go, what stuff? You've already covered so much stuff. And I'm like, no, just a little more that I want to talk about because hyper-focusedness, right? So it starts with job management. We have folks today that use SQL Server Agent to do job management for many different things. Backing up databases, maintaining indexes, all sorts of really cool stuff, right? And for managed instance, SQL Server Agent in its full glory exists there, right? So that's there. SQL Server Agents in managed instance, and it's a great migration store for you. Take your agent jobs, be able to pull those into managed instance. Unfortunately for SQL database, since it's really not an instance, agent doesn't exist there, but there's a really cool thing called Elastic Jobs. And it's meant for helping you with Elastic databases and, Elastic pools and so forth, but it can be used outside of that. And in fact, in the book and Azure SQL Revealed, I showed an example of going through and rebuilding indexes across 10 databases at the same time. Using Elastic Jobs as a service, you get to build like these jobs that are T-SQL based. So you get to connect to your Azure SQL database, and Elastic Jobs comes with a database that you point it to. Think of that as like your MSDB to schedule a job. So that's pretty cool. Also, there's something pretty powerful called Azure Automation with something called Runbooks. So with PowerShell and various things like that, you could build a schedule of tasks to do things in the cloud. And this is really nice, Anna, because this is kind of like serverless, right? You are going through with either agent, Elastic Jobs, or automation, and you're not actually building another VM to do all this work. We will provide all the compute for you. You just declare what you want to do. So there's different ways you can do job management, and a lot of times those are combined with things to do with SQL type activities. But there's other SQL Server capabilities that are interesting for you to note. So SQL 19 has this really cool thing called Polybase, and we don't have that full capability in PAS yet. But people, you may not realize this, but you could do an external table, something like you could do in Polybase, and you can do that across Azure SQL databases or even into a serverless SQL pool in Synapse, which is a really interesting scenario where you can effectively, you're building like a cross database type query to another Azure SQL database or to serverless. Now we have the full, not the full, but the link server capabilities for SQL-based providers exist in managed instance. And then look at the different options here. So you can do link servers to Azure SQL VM database instance, a SQL server, or even to Azure Synapse SQL pools themselves. And so other things exist on here that are surface level things you should know about. We've kind of mentioned some of these, but if you didn't know Database Mail and now Service Broker, I think there's a new announcement on that, Service Broker across managed instances for Service Broker applications. We've had some customers come to us and say, look, I need Service Broker. I'm relying on this. And managed instance is going to give you those capabilities. And then full text search is interesting. It's been in the product for a very long period of time. But if you haven't looked at the Azure Search integration, specifically, especially with Azure SQL Database, that's a really cool concept. So don't just say, hey, I just need to keep full text search going. You might go further with the cloud and use this Azure Search integration. It's pretty powerful. There are other cognitive services capabilities with Azure Search that you wouldn't get from SQL full text search. Now, we just announced general availability for Azure for machine learning services with R and Python in managed instance. And I think you even had a data exposed episode not long ago where we showed off those capabilities and why that's a great story for you in the cloud. Distributed transactions are an interesting one. And for a while, we did not have this capability except for Azure VM. In fact, that was a reason why you had to use VM. But now you can do that in preview and managed instance across Azure managed instances. I mentioned the XP command shell is not supported only because some people are relying on that capability in SQL Server today. But, Anna, every time I've talked to a customer about this, I said to them, hey, I know so many people that just turn this off because it is kind of a surface level attack vector for your SQL server. So we don't support that, and I don't envision us supporting that in a platform as service environment anytime soon. And then this is really interesting. Database migration service is out there today as an Azure service. We have this new capability called log replay service to do an online migration. And I'd like to show you that to you here in a second. But first, let me just also mention that we talked about this a little bit throughout our other modules here, but there are some new errors unique to Azure that are not in SQL Server, and we've got a hyperlink. You can go find it. You can just do a search. You can just look at error handling in Azure SQL, and we will show you some of those examples. And we've talked about some of those. So remember we said that if your gateway's up but your database is unavailable, you might get a different error than you would like in SQL Server when you can't connect. Or you might have run into the maximum number of sessions in Azure SQL Database, which isn't a thread pool wait now, it's an actual error. So there's new errors that you need to handle in your application, and we talk about those. The good news, Anna, is that it's not an exhaustive list, but there's some specifically you need to think about in a platform as a service environment. And then this is really interesting because I've had this question before. Customers are like, look, I used to get like this thing called a stack dump. And Anna, I've been across the world actually sometimes showing stack dumps on stage with debuggers and so forth. And often you take the stack dump and you contact Microsoft support and they will help you with this. But guess what? In Azure SQL, you don't have access to those, but that's a good thing. In fact, we monitor for these things behind the scenes and decide whether it should cause a failover. But then we look for these all the time, and we're always diagnosing should we fix this proactively, which is that great benefit of versionless.
Yeah, definitely. This is a great list, and Bob, we have a little bit of time left, so I would love to see this demo of migrating to MI with LRS, and this is something I haven't actually seen before. So.
Oh, okay. Well, let's show it off. It's pretty cool. So let me share my screen, and you tell me if you can see this okay here.
Yes, I can see it.
So here's my goal. I've got a SQL 16 Azure VM going. So one of the cool things about log replay service is, let's say you're already in the cloud with Azure VM, but you would like to migrate online to managed instance. So your backups are already at Azure storage. Why not just take advantage of that and just access those things and migrate for you with a few PowerShell commands to your managed instance online? So to quickly kind of demonstrate this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and back up a full version of my database. I don't know how that name got in there, the name of the database. I don't know who created that. Oh, I know. It's because that school just won the national championship in basketball. So in case you haven't heard about that before, that's why that's there. So I'm going to back up the database, notice, to an Azure Blob Storage container. So I'm going to do that. And then let me flip over to the Cloud Shell and show you what I've got here. I've got a PowerShell command like this. And let's kind of look at this a little bit here. I'm going to use this is in preview now, a new PowerShell command called log replay here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, here's where the database backup is. Here's where I'm putting that database. And I've got a SAS token for security reasons, so I can get access to it. But notice I say autocomplete, restore, and then I say, here's the name of the backup to look for so you can complete the online migration. So I'm going to start this. Let me just kick this in. And let's just make sure we understand what's going on here. It's like running as a job now. So what's happening is the log replay service behind the scenes, because you told it to, is going to go to your Azure Blob Storage, and we gave it credentials here with this shared access signature. So it's going to go to this Azure container. It's going to grab that full backup that you've done. It's going to restore it for you in Azure SQL Managed Instance. Okay, it's going to start that process. Now your database is going to be in the restoring state. So you're asking yourself, well, how do I do an online migration? Well, you could be making changes to this 2016 database, and then you want to do that final log backup, like your tail of the log backup. In this particular case, though, I'm telling log replay, when you see this backup show up in that container, that means I'm done. So you automatically pick that up, restore it, and put me online. So let's go see in the portal if we can see what that looks like. Well, first of all, here's where my backups exist. So this is that Azure storage where the backups are. And so then I'm going to go over here. Let's go. Yeah, sorry. I had it right there. So you see here, it says that the database is in the restoring state. So what I'll just do is let me go over here back to the 16 VM, and let's just do a log backup. I'm not going to make any changes, but I'm just testing this out to see this works. So I'm going to do a log backup to the same container, but I'm going to use that name that I said was the one to monitor for. So when I do this, the whole idea being in the portal is that when the log replay service is monitoring this, is that when it detects that this log backup is here, it's going to restore it and then bring the database online with recovery, because right now it's in what's called no recovery mode, where you can't access it because it's restoring. But again, I don't need it until I'm ready to cut over. So this is kind of like this auto cut over capability. So let's go back over here and let's see here. So this is where, in this particular case, when the log replay service is able to restore the log, it can do this and just bring this database online, and think of this as being like the online cutover. But I'm just testing this. This isn't really about production. So let me flip back over and show you more of that experience. So what I've got now is I've got like 10 databases over here. You see this, like 10 databases. My goal is to go restore those in parallel and then do an online cutover in parallel for all these databases. So I will back these up with one script. I mean, you might have different ways of doing this, but notice here I'm using different folders. They're called like virtual folders within the container. So I'm going to run all of these, and they're going to back up all these databases, to this container in these different folders. So in PowerShell, I'll do something just a little bit different here than I did before. Let me get over to that. So in PowerShell, I've got a different script here called start lsprod or lsprod.powershell. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the power of as PowerShell, but this log replay gives me the ability to run this as a job. Now this is not autocomplete. This just says go restore this. In fact, let me just kick it off actually. Start LRS prod. And you might see this state of not started, but that's actually not 100% true. It's all running asynchronously in parallel. All 10 of these databases are being restored at the same time because they all exist out there in Azure Storage in these different folders. That's part of the requirement, is that you must be in different folders. So you told, with 10 different PowerShell commands, you told it, hey, go get this started. And then once this is started, this is where you're going to control the cutover a little differently. You're going to back up your logs, and then you're going to tell log replay, hey, I'm done. You complete it yourself. In fact, let's just kind of go back into the portal a little bit here and see. Let me get here. So now can you see this, Anna? You can see that this has come online.
Okay.
Yeah, this one's already come online that I did, and these other ones are in this restoring state now automatically. So now you make changes, but you say, I would like to bring all of them online in parallel. So I'm going to go back over to my 16, and I'm going to go back up a tail of the log for all the databases. So let this run, and then when this is done, I'm going to go back over into the Cloud Shell. Let's do that. The Azure Cloud Shell. Let's go back over here. And I've got a different script to complete this. So let's go ahead and run this, and we'll take a look at it. Complete LRS prod.ps1. Let's run it. Now this is a little bit different. The completion doesn't have this as job parameter, so I'm doing something interesting. I'll show you an example of one of these. I'm using the power of PowerShell jobs. So this complete LRS just calls a bunch of different scripts, and one of them looks like this. I'm going to actually run this right here, this complete, but I'm running it as separately as an Azure job. Well, how does that? What do you mean by that, Bob? Well, if you look at this over, notice I'm using the start job commandlet for PowerShell. And so this is each script. And again, back to the script, notice here, there's a separate command here called complete Azure log replay. And then here's the name of the log backup. So it's not been listening for this log backup. I'm telling it when I'm ready to cut over, that is the last log back I'm going to do. When you see that, you restore it and you bring it online automatically for me. So if I go back over here, let's just kind of see if we can see the behavior. And you see they're still all they're all effectively in the restoring state. But now they're all there they go. The magic of the cloud. So everybody's online now. So think about what I did. I took 10 databases. By the way, we can do up to 100. This is during preview right now. We can do up to 100 of these. I can say, hey, I'm going to put all these in a container with folders. I'm going to tell you where they are. You put them in the restoring state. I'm going to go over and continue to use my Azure VM, make all the changes. When I'm ready for a cutover, it's pretty fast. I just say, hey, here are my last log backups. You do the cutover. And within, you can start here with less than a minute. I'm up and all online with an online migration. So it's a perfect example of doing an online migration, especially from that Azure VM to managed instance situation.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. That was really cool. I actually had not seen that before. Really cool. I'm going to have to go play with it. And I can do that because it's available in preview. So I'll definitely be checking that out. We have about 10 minutes left. We wanted to talk a little bit about, okay, now I've learned how to translate my skills from SQL Server to Azure SQL. You even got a bonus tip from Bob on how to migrate potentially to managed instance with LRS. But we want to let you know that, once you move to the cloud, it's not just SQL Server in the cloud, but everything else that Azure has to offer. So there's all sorts of different services that you can integrate in, regardless of your industry or your scenario. There's going to be various solutions and pieces that, if you were to go build these in-house, you would take a very, very long time. So we have some examples, but, translating from SQL Server to Azure SQL is really just the kickoff point, really, to me. We're really just scratching the surface on what Azure itself has to offer as a whole. And we have some scenarios. For example, Bob, I think you found this scenario online.
Think about, Anna, in your environment today, if you're in your data center or your company, you had to go build that right there. Somebody said, go build an IoT application. And by the way, make sure you include Azure ID authentication, stream analytics processing. Oh, can you do some machine learning with it? And can you put a logic app into it and do some reporting on it, right? All that kind of stuff.
Right.
This would be hard. So you might have the SQL Server part figured out, but other parts are going to require a lot of different software you have to install, purchase, etc. All this is possible in Azure. So you see SQL database being the warm path store for this in this scenario right here. But doing all this is possible in the cloud. And Anna, some of this is serverless things, right? Like the function app or the logic app. You don't provision a VM. Azure Database, you don't provision a VM. In fact, actually, now that I think about it, this is all server. When I say the word serverless, I mean, you're not provisioning a VM here. You're just saying and declaring, I'd like an IoT hub. I'd like a function app. I'd like a database. Give me some storage. I'd like to build a machine learning app and a logic app. Oh, by the way, I'd like to process stream analytics on it. And then I'd like to go do reporting with Power BI. Incredibly cool, Anna. But I tell you what, though, and we have a GitHub example that you can go look at. If you just go search up IoT example Azure, we have a GitHub that you can see the code example. But I think you've been working on something that kind of shows the story of Azure SQL Database. That's real?
Yeah, I would love to give a sneak peek of this new thing that I've been working on with Davide Mauri around catching the bus. So let me just switch over to that quickly. So what you're seeing here is the sample. So this is live today. I put the link in the slide, which I'll go back to. But basically the idea of this application was to build a serverless full stack application where we just happen to leverage Azure SQL. So what you're seeing here is we're going to be collecting real-time data from an IoT device in the buses. Specifically, we looked at the Seattle metro area. So we're getting real-time data in the form of JSON. And we're using Azure Functions, which are also a serverless. We're using those with a combination of Azure Logic Apps to send notifications to users when their bus is near their geofence or say, near their office building or where they want to catch the bus from. And they send that via Outlook. And this was all very easy to develop using Azure. And I'll also add that supporting this whole backbone is really Azure SQL Database, because Azure SQL Database supports JSON, supports geospatial queries. So all this was easy to do because of the power of the SQL engine that all of our viewers already know. It's just a matter of piecing these things together. We brought the route reference data in so we could associate these two things together. And then we use an Azure Static Web App, all powered by GitHub Actions, to deploy a website. So I'll give you guys a sneak peek at what this looks like. But then I'd love for you guys to check it out. So this is my Azure Static Web App, which basically combines the power of Azure Web App Services with Azure Functions. So you'll also see my Azure Web App has Azure Functions associated with it as well. And then this is my actual application. So if I come in here, I'm just going to go ahead and refresh it. And what you're going to see here we go. So what you're going to see, all these circles, I can zoom in a little further, all these circles are buses on the route I'm monitoring. And this geofence represents where I want to catch the bus. So where I want to be notified that the bus is coming so I can catch it. So now I have a web page so I can track when my bus is getting close by. And then I also have this Azure function, which is doing all of that stuff for me. So for example, it's seeing, okay, we have 466 buses, but only 5 of them is in the route that you actually care about. So that's great. And if one, let's see, this has been running for a while. If one, here's a good example. If one is activating or entering or exiting a geofence, what we're going to do is we're going to call a logic app giving that information about the vehicle and the route and whether or not it's entering or exiting that geofence. So now that we have that, let me see. Let me refresh my inbox. What we will hopefully see is that we have some emails here since we have been, oh, sure enough, yep, we got some here. And you'll be able to see when your bus is entering or exiting the geofence. And if this would load, there would also be some email text. We're just gonna keep on going. Now, what I wanted to also stress is that all of this, here, all of this is being powered by GitHub Actions, which means, for example, if we look at my Azure SQL database GitHub Actions, whenever I update my database, that schema is actually being updated by Azure SQL Actions. So it's going to look at my database. It's going to analyze my existing database. It's going to update the database as needed and then publish that updated database. So this is the way I can deploy updated schema to my databases in my environment. And of course, we also have these available for Azure Static Web Apps and Azure Functions. And even when things go wrong, you can troubleshoot them. So all of this is surfaced in this serverless sample here. So if I go back here, that's where you can find that aka.ms/catch-the-bus. But just one of the ways you can really take advantage of all that Azure has to offer. Now, we have just a few minutes left. I'm going to kind of go through some resources pretty briefly. You've seen these resources week after week, but we definitely recommend you check them all out and stay connected with us. And Bob, I think you have a final call to action for our viewers.
Yeah, if you've seen what we've talked about in all these 6 weeks, I don't think there's an excuse not to try this. You have a free sandbox to go try out Azure, right? We talked about our learning path. But you know what? Pick a workload, pick something small, go to the what to use when scenarios that we even talked about, and authentication methods and all those different things. So you can kind of get a feel for how do you deploy and use Azure SQL. And then do a proof of concept, right? A lot of people forget that they have like toolboxes of scripts and things in nature that help them maintain and use their SQL server. Make sure you try and test all those out in your Azure SQL deployment. But I know it sounds like it's just a test thing, but it's not. It is ready for you. We have great case studies of customers in very large production scenarios with large databases, large number of users, mission critical applications, gaming platforms, you name it, that are using Azure SQL today, which is why we call it the world's database. So I'm pretty excited that somebody could go through this 6-week series, could get going, but here is our call to action for you to get started once you've picked up and gained your knowledge.
Yeah, I think it's a great call to action that Azure is ready for you. If you happen to miss any of these sessions or you want to study and go past DP300, which we encourage all of you to do, you can go to aka.ms.learn live to see our previous episodes all throughout the series. And Learn Live doesn't end with us. I mean, I know you wish it was just us that came on every Monday, but the next series is really interesting. You saw a sneak peek of GitHub Actions, and we have a whole series dedicated to learning more about Git. So I definitely recommend this. It's definitely a way towards CI/CD and managing code in the future. I also wanted to call out this event that we're doing called Innovate today with Azure SQL. Bob, do you want to tell people just a tiny bit about what this is? Because I know you're involved.
I'm kind of involved with this. You might see me show up in this as your host for this event. Hey, want to hear from Rohan Kumar, our corporate vice president, about Azure SQL, how important it is? A surprise guest may show up. I think some other people that you may know may show up and doing some demonstrations as well. And then we have people like myself and others from the engineering team. We have the MVPs from the SQL community, video testimonies from Microsoft Mechanics with customers. We have it all. A lot more details about stuff we've talked about in our fundamentals and learning path and more. So stay tuned. I think it's going to be one of the largest digital events we've ever done on this topic.
I'm looking forward to it. Just to wrap this up, we want to thank you all so much for spending your time with us. We know you have a choice of where you spend your time. We appreciate you spend it with us. We hope it was useful. Please let us know. Please like, subscribe, add a comment, whatever. We're just so happy and thank you. And we'll see you next week. Well, not us, but someone else will see you next week on Learn Live.
Thanks again, everybody.